everybody, my name is Anthony Cornejo, and welcome back to this week's episode. In this episode, we will be discussing spatial accessibility and inaccessibility within Los Angeles, and more importantly, the role space plays in constructing race, racialized communities, and producing stereotypes. To begin, it is important we acknowledge the construction of race as a whole. It is foolish to claim that race did not exist prior to Western settler colonialism in the 15th and 16th centuries. However, the concept of race did not become constructed until this time. Rather than the boundaries of identity pertaining to religion, the boundary of identity translated to racial skin color due to settler colonialism. Thus, as Michael Omi and Howard Winant point out, race is a social construct. Racialization developed because of settler colonialism. But in this episode specifically, we are analyzing the spatial construction of race within Los Angeles. I'm using Los Angeles as a case study, not only because we spent the entire class analyzing it, but it's just a great example of how space and race interact, especially as it's home to many Latinx individuals. To begin, one of the first waves we see of Latinx immigration into the United States, and more specifically Los Angeles, is in the early 1900s through job opportunities in relation to railroad construction. But Los Angeles did not start experiencing a massive influx of immigrants until 1942 with the creation of the Bracero program. Many of these migrants were men and agricultural workers who came to the U.S. to work as Bracero workers, which then created an avenue for even more Latinx immigration as families of these Bracero workers gradually joined them. Then, in 1965, the Immigration and Nationality Act led to steady Latin American immigration. Now, focusing on Los Angeles specifically, I want to discuss Chavez Ravine. With mass Latinx immigration, it is no question that people naturally want to live with people who look like them, share the same traditions, background, and etc. Thus, predominantly Latinx neighborhoods began to develop in Los Angeles, but the larger issue at hand is spatial construction and the way institutions specifically design spaces to limit people and allow racialized ideas to grow through spatial planning. So, Chavez Ravine, a predominantly Mexican-American neighborhood, started facing troubles beginning in 1950, with city officials viewing this area as a perfect spot for development, despite a huge community already living there. City officials began to urge residents to move out in order for the construction of public housing known as Elysian Park Heights. This project eventually fell out in 1953, but most residents were already forcibly removed or willingly left themselves. Thus, by 1958, not that many people were living there, but people were still living there, and they were predominantly Latinx. But, like I said, by 1958, this area was sold to the Brooklyn Dodgers, and the entire Chavez Ravine area was cleared out, forcibly removing the remaining families. All this to say, space and race go together. The Chavez Ravine communities were stripped of their space by public officials and city planning. And this is not something new. This has been going on since settler colonialism. Space and race are working together to decide who has access to certain spaces and who doesn't. So, at least in Los Angeles, this sets a precedent and continues to uphold previous precedent since the beginning of racial construction through settler colonialism, that marginalized communities can be relegated to spaces that are constant victims to urban spatial construction. Now, I want to move on to the construction of highways in Los Angeles. Once again, major highways were constructed in spaces of marginalized communities. As was showcased in class, by looking at a map of Los Angeles and its highways, we notice a pattern. Highways are built directly through marginalized communities, and because of these precedents already set, city planners feel it is okay to constantly uproot marginalized communities while also allowing affluent, predominantly white affluent communities to have no highway construction going directly through them. But beyond spatial construction and the lack of spatial accessibility offered to marginalized groups, space itself allows racialized stereotypes to evolve. For this example, I want you to picture East LA and Lincoln Heights. Both are areas with predominantly Latinos living in them, and there are marginalized groups. These neighborhoods face constant removal from city officials, and there is a clear lack of government resources implemented into these neighborhoods. If the city already designs their spaces in a way that limits them and doesn't pay attention to these spaces or provide resources, this increases the possibility for high crime and violence rates within these communities. So these communities have many stereotypes of crime and violence, and statistically it is true. However, we need to look at the context before just determining that these are just places of violence. This is the direct result of spatial inaccessibility. City planning intentionally ignores these communities and provides them little support, making it easier for these groups to fall into these already set stereotypes. Something as simple as loitering within a predominantly black and brown neighborhood in Los Angeles is enforced as a crime. I understand that many businesses throughout Los Angeles prohibit loitering. However, it is often these communities of color that are constant targets. City officials are actively limiting spatial movement and criminalizing marginalized communities for simply existing at this point. One thing I find very interesting and representative of the issues created by race and space is Emmanuel Pastor and Pierre Hondagno Sotelo's Finding Home and Building Community in South LA. They conduct interviews with Latinos living in South LA regarding their experiences, and one interviewee claims, start quote, "My cousins who grew up in Lincoln Heights or in East LA, they will make comments, ignorant comments, that have to do with race when they refer to African Americans, and my sister and I react very differently. To us, it's like you're talking about our extended family. They, the African Americans, were the ones that were around there, that saw me walk home, that were extending a helping hand to my parents when they needed it. So to me, I see it differently," end quote. To me, this quote is really powerful because it showcases the repercussions of space and race. Because race is so tightly connected with space, individuals outside of South LA have this idea that South LA is such a negative and violent space due to its racial composition. Interestingly enough, these remarks, at least from this quote, are coming from individuals residing in Lincoln Heights and East LA, an already marginalized black and brown community with many Latinos living there. Space creates these racializations and effectively pits marginalized groups against one another. In a place like Los Angeles, pitting these communities and neighborhoods against one another further contributes to gang violence. Crime is occurring because of these racialized stereotypes produced through spatial inaccessibility. And while all this is happening, individuals like the interviewee recognize that these stereotypes aren't always true. As a Latinx individual, this person feels that they belong within this community. A community that's known for its black population, they are able to transcend beyond the racial boundary because of their shared space. Space itself isn't limited to harming marginalized communities, although it very clearly does. But like I said, it continues to evolve race and these racialized concepts. All of this to say, space is intentional. Settler colonialism and the need for space is one of the driving factors in the construction of race in the first place. I use Los Angeles not only because of its large Latinx population, but because it is a great example of how race and space interact with one another. As has been the story since the beginning, marginalized communities, especially the Latinx community, constantly face spatial inaccessibility. We saw this with the forced displacement of the Chavez Ravine residents and the construction of highways. And something that I also didn't mention is in the 1990s with the Pico Aliso housing projects, which also further displaced residents living in Boyle Heights. This spatial inaccessibility, which I want to note, did not begin in Los Angeles. It, like I said earlier, it began with settler colonialism in relation to race. But this spatial inaccessibility of Latinos in Los Angeles set precedent for how the city and city officials will continue to treat and view marginalized communities. We are treated as though we are not worthy enough to receive the same advantages and luxuries that affluent white communities receive. And well, it's the truth. Neighborhoods in South LA, East LA, and Lincoln Heights are all victim to this. City officials ignore these black and brown communities, allowing racialized ideas to develop because of these spaces. So space is intentional, and it continues to drive what people think and how people treat Latinx communities in Los Angeles. Thank you.